You mentioned in the lesson that the early reformers got their way of reading Scripture from the Renaissance period.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, it's a little-known fact, actually, and it's one that Protestants don't like to admit, okay? Because we want to say we got our way of reading the Bible from Jesus. Okay, that's what we want to say. But it's not, historically speaking, it's not quite that simple. The medieval church had such a hold on how to interpret the Bible because, again, the Bible wasn't much available, that it really wasn't as simple as people saying, okay, now we're going to do it a different way. Certain cracks had to be made in that hold. And the cracks started happening when, during the Renaissance, just prior to the Reformation, people began to discover old texts of the Greek writers, for example, and Latin texts of Roman writers. Religious, some of them religious texts, others of them just poetry, lyrical poetry, and things like that. Mm-hmm. And in those days, wealthy people would often be sponsors or patrons of scholars. Unlike today where schools, generally speaking, sponsor scholars, in those days wealthy people would. If you had lots of money, you always wanted some scholar attached to your manor or something like that. And prior to the days of the Renaissance, most of these scholars were paid by their patrons to work on biblical things, to work on theology, and to do that within the confines of the church, because this was a way in which you actually got good standing in the church, was, you pay for some priest to work on some text or something like that related to the Bible. But then as these other texts began to be exposed, Greek text and Latin text, these wealthy patrons began to become very interested in that. Because during the medieval period in Europe, there was this sort of underground Christianity that was actually pagan. And they were discovering in these old texts different attitudes toward morality, toward sexuality, things like that, that they liked, to be perfectly frank. And they liked it more than what the official Catholic line was. The unofficial line was probably more like what they were doing. And so when they would find these pagan texts and they would read them, they wanted to know more. And so wealthy people began to support the translation of and the commentary on those kinds of passages. Well, what's a scholar to do? The scholar who works on those kinds of materials does not have the church canons to guide him. Okay, there's no right way to interpret. You don't lay the fourfold interpretation on it. You don't have any way of getting the church's authoritative stamp on it. And so what you do is you begin to try to uncover what these texts meant. And the basic technique was you read it as it was originally intended to be read. So rather than reading into the light of the theology of the church, you began to read the Greek text as if it were Greek. Imagine that, okay? As if it were written by pagans back in their day, and the Latin text the same ways, and the Latin translations of the Greek text the same ways. It wasn't until the Renaissance that we even began to have in Europe anything but Arabic translations of Aristotle. They began to uncover fragments here in libraries there that had old Greek translations or records of it, as well as Latin. But up to that point, basically it was Arabic. And you had to read Arabic in order to even understand Aristotle. So it was very interesting how this happened, and then opens the door for the influence of Aristotelian philosophy in the church later on during the medieval period. So you get this whole movement then that scholarship is no longer subservient to the church, subservient to the laws of interpretation and the ways that the esoteric interpretations of the church had laid out, but rather it's much more realistic. It's what we would call realistic. You would start interpreting a passage like it was meant to be interpreted by the original writer as much as you possibly could.